Rachel, actually. I listened to your presentation a couple of times before, and I always have questions, but I have a different...
This one's slightly different, though.
I know. I noticed that. And my question is different as well. Because Duška reminded me that there were, of course, other tobacco factories in the empire at that time. And my question is, were there attempts to reach out to those other tobacco workers during the strike, or before the strike, or after the strike? And were some of these attempts limited to women, or were there just general attempts to, was there an attempt to organize as women tobacco workers across the empire?
Not that I saw in this particular instance. Like, it was very specific to the Sarajevo factory, and also there was a strike at the Mostar factory, possibly also in Banja Luka, but in this particular instance, it's very specific to the factory. There had been some interaction between tobacco workers, though, from Bosnia to the other parts of the monarchy. I think I read at some point that when the monopoly was initially established, they sent a bunch of workers from Sarajevo to Vienna, I think, to train in some of the factories there. So there's these hints of cooperation and movement. And you see a lot more of that on the administrative side of things, like Praktikanten move very frequently between the Austrian, Bosnian, and the Hungarian monopolies. But you don't really see organization in these terms in Bosnia at the time. However, if we're talking about May 1906 more broadly, there's definitely in Croatia, Slavonia, a lot of interest. So actually the Social Democratic Party activists in Osijek send posters, flyers to, I think it's like Vareš or something, to strikers there saying like, keep on strike. The workers of Croatia, Slavonia, Austria, whatever, are supporting you. So from a broader labor perspective, yes, but for women tobacco workers, not specifically.
Thanks.
Okay, yes, thank you. Chiara?
I have a question for Rachel about the tobacco workers. Like, you mentioned some kind of sense of entitlement or sense of, Rachel mentioned that they were contacting different institutions, and then Ushka, you were mentioning like these differences in treatment between the interwar and the post-World War II period in terms of the benefits that some of these workers would have. And that reminded me of this brilliant documentary by Željina Žilnik, Vera Jeržika, about the textile workers, in which you see these two elderly textile workers who were about to retire, were very aware of their rights, right? So they go and ask for the disabled pension, and one started working when she was 14, and she asked for that year to be recognized, even though the legal age was 15 or something. So they're really aware of all of this entitlement. So I was wondering if you could notice like this sense of entitlement as workers, this kind of dignity of labor before the classic Yugoslav emphasis. Like what happened like in this pre-World War I or inter-war period? Do they have already a sense of, oh yes, our manual labor is give us some kind of dignity or some kind of, we should be getting certain benefits for it, for our hard labor?
I'll go quickly first. In my case, the way that it's phrased is not, like in some instances, it's we deserve these things because I've worked here for a very long time. There's one person in particular who makes that claim, like I've worked at the factory for 12 years, I deserve to have this benefit. But there's also this idea that they're dues paying members, so they pay into it, therefore that's why they receive it. It's not necessarily like based in this idea of like I labor and it's my labor itself that gives me that right. It's more the way that I see it, and the way that it's more anchored into is like this idea of like the state, this discourse around rights and this understanding of rights in the space of democratization towards the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. That's how I see it more in these terms, and I think that's how it's put forward. It's much more we're members, therefore.
Yes, very interesting question indeed. I think that this deserves a view a little bit in general, addressing the labor rights, because in the interwar period, the labor movement was actually decapitated. Unions were very poor. There were also many threats on women, on workers in general, and also unions. They existed, but they weren't effective as much. Also, the labor legislation was not so favored, was not very good towards the workers. And the state, which was the employer actually, as tobacco factories was a state-owned business, they were actually maneuvering with worker status in order to get less expenses for various social benefits and so. This is a very broad thing, whereas also the sources are very petty in comparison to the post-war period, where of course we in Yugoslavia also have this self-management system which allowed workers to take part in various meetings, which produced minutes, very, very, I have to say that they're very interesting in terms of giving us historians view on how the working collective actually was behaving. And of course, the majority of studies addressing the interwar periods were actually raised in the post-war period, which also gave us maybe a little biased image, as we know that the interwar periods were in generally pictured as very unfavored towards the workers. Whereas, of course, we have this socialist politics, which was giving workers another status. But as you know well from your studies, it was not a monolithic image. You had norms, you had, certain rules within the factory in terms of the state, but they were not always put in practice. So, but in general, I have to say that definitely, those who were, let's say, disabled as workers, they got more opportunities. However, various minutes also from the, because there were many minutes are available in the post-war period. There were ones of the Workers' Council, which is very, very, let's say, it's a pile of documents actually that addresses this issue. Then you have management board minutes. Then you also have minutes of the Communist Party and the Union. So you have 4 different sources that actually give us various ideas of how this tissue was working tissue or working collective was actually working. And these sources, they do not present homogeneous picture. For instance, those Communist Party minutes, they give a lot of emphasis on also on more of emphasizing what was not achieved and should be. And here we can see a huge discrepancies between what is said in terms of propaganda and what has not been achieved. So, but I still believe that in comparison to the interwar years, to sum up, position for workers were better than, yeah.
Thank you. I see Katja, yes. I would just like to intervene, maybe because I find this, I try to kind of connect all three papers together. And I was thinking when Mansa was presenting her paper, and I find this entitlement actually as something that connects all three presentations. Of course, it's part of like labor rights movement that you like was. We could say that like through the 20th century it was present, like different scale, different periods. But I would like maybe Mansa to say something. What do you think? This like the concept of entitlement can disconnect the work of intellectuals, how we look at it through like the labor history perspective, and also when this I becomes weak, because here it's different. I mean, in the factor, even if you think outside of trade unions.
Mm-hmm. I think intellectual work or the status of intellectual for marginalized groups, women and also queer people, people of color and so on, is something that is very hard to be entitled to because there were no, you had no role models, and that's very complicated. That's one of the basic questions of Virginia's The Room of One's Own is, what did our mothers do? All they did was they powdered their noses and they didn't save up any money for us. That's what they did. So this is, so the first question is, who is the first generation who can claim I'm an intellectual? And how is this divided in between classes? I think for women of upper middle class, it was much easier to say I'm a poet. It was or a painter, or it was also sort of a thing that bourgeois families did. They played the piano, did their paintings. It was all cute, but this is not like. But to go in public, to be sort of political in a sense that you, with your intellectual work, go into public sphere, that's a thing of the 20th century. And I would say that marginalized groups still struggle with this entitlement to say, I am an intellectual, I am an academic, I have right to a fair job, to fair position in society and so on. I think we're still not there actually, so the struggle continues.
Okay, thank you. Okay, sorry Katja.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Marta. I could relate very much to your talk and also to your question, Naomi. As I'm researching women artists who worked in socialist publishing for children, and I'm also thinking a lot about condition, or I also do ethnographic work, so conditions of production and the reasons of feminization, because in some of the Yugoslav contexts, illustration for children and production, artistic production for children was very feminized. And there is a lot of reasons, but the huge problem, or how to deal with class, because even in the socialist framework, many little women of working class could work as illustrators full-time. So obviously this has to do with what you also said, the concept of genius from the autonomous arts and the way the applied arts and the fine arts are valued or not valued, and so forth. So you already talked about it, but how you approach class and basically the reproduction or new production of classes within the socialist framework.
The question of class within the socialist Yugoslavia is, I'm afraid, that's such a complicated topic that's I would at this point avoid. Is just simply because it got so conflicted also, first of all, because of the pre-war class structure, and then how this structure changed into a new class of the leading class. So I think it's on several levels. I think it's easier for me just here to answer the gender dynamic, which is, the most famous ones is, Gabriela Stupica is such a genius, and Marlenka Stupica paints really cute Pika Nogavička.
Yeah, but I think the gender dynamic is bound to class. So.
And it's also bound to who is who was professor at the academy. This is, I think, Academy of Arts was a very strong, or the architectural one was a very strong ideological monolith, I think. But I think it's also the way that we see who has done a certain work. Someone I know, I talked to the curator a few weeks ago, and she's preparing a big exhibition of a well-known male painter. And I said, are you going to include his wife as well? She did so many things for him, and she was also an academic painter. And she said, oh no, we're not allowed to do this because of dedici, because they don't allow us to use her, because apparently she had an affair, they didn't have, a good relationship, so we will just keep her out of the narrative. So I think this of what woman needs to do in order to be part of the establishment has still so many layers, not only class and education, but also the way she behaved or, misbehaved and so on.
Yeah, because my problem is very concrete. If I approach the iconographic level, for example, the question of reproductive work, and even if I talk with illustrators who then report on how they kind of handle their reproductive work with their artistic work and so forth, it turns out, this has a very limited, so to say, it's basically about specific class. And it doesn't tell so much about the whole society in a way. It tells more about the habitus of this particular artistic, socialist, intellectual class.
I would say that the art world is a class world on its own. So you don't only have wives or daughters or whoever who help, but you also have assistants who are underpaid and so on. So, and the labor reproduction is really rarely documented. There are so many, in the big artisan production, there are so many people involved, but they're rarely mentioned still. So I think the art sector is one of the most classist systems that we have, yes.
If I may jump in here, I would like to point to one of my previous observations, because I was also studying the biography of Ivana Kubilca, and I paid my attention to her social network, and I realized how important it was for her to have friends in various areas, that she could actually get an education, which was not possible for women in the Habsburg monarchy, where she could actually stay in quite classy metropolis, having actually no money of her own. How she actually stayed in high bourgeoisie area without having proper resources. And I think that the concept of social network, the quality of social ties, is very important when dealing with biographies, because of course it might sound very, let's say, but it works. I mean, not only in the space of art, which is, I agree totally, a special space with its own rules, and it's a very complicated picture as much as I learned. And of course also certain social or psychological features are also very important, that you're persistent, that you are actually giving a lot of your spare time and your resources to achieve some work without having an idea to be repaid. It's more about the creativity, maybe, in terms of the artists. And
I think that's a very problematic concept.
Is it?
Yeah.
Okay, in what sense?
In a sense that you don't gain anything back if you produce a large work of art. I mean, it's this idea that the nation, the fame, the whatever will pay the genius back. It's that this is the myth of a poor artist, which I think is very problematic, because at the end of the day, everyone needs to pay bills and has somewhere to live, and it's
Yeah, but it is, my observation is that within the socially self-managed publishing, a lot of their democratic structures were implemented that basically worked against this kind of privatization, so to say, social networked privatization of art, public tenders, fairs, the exhibitions that were based on open calls and so forth. And there were very kind of broadened structures of different entries into the system. But again, applied arts, yeah. I mean, artistic production for children, not really art, huh?
You can't really hang it in the gallery, no.
Yeah. But it's basically more relevant because
yeah, of course,
out
but
of
it's
different reasons. But yeah, so this is another problematics, how the social construction of the value of applied or autonomous arts.
Okay, thank you. Now we have Lisa and then Jovana.
I have a very, very specific question for Usha. So you also displayed the diploma or the thesis in the faculty of social work, or back then it was a school for social work at the faculty. And based on that observation, I know the first kindergarten, basically, I think all night as well, was built by the factory.
Yes.
And I'm curious, I know that my study was behind it, but I'm curious if there was if you found in the archives any interaction between the workers in the debates in the kindergarten, or was it just a higher end decision, we will make this and that's it?
Well, in regard to the kindergarten, the sources are very holy, I have to say. I checked the map of the factory and there was a place predicted for the kindergarten. But the kindergarten was only established in 1906, if I'm correct. And this was done on demand of a social democratic union, which was one of the unions taking place in tobacco factory. The other was Christian democratic. And of course, the majority of women in tobacco factory did not belong to Social Democratic Union, but to Christian Democratic Union in Slovenia, in Ljubljana. Whereas, for instance, in Klagenfurt, it was just the opposite picture. And we also get from the newspapers that Christian Democratic Union advised women to put children into the kindergarten. So there was a very huge political debate about this issue. I have no idea what was in the interwar period because I
And what about the socialist?
Okay, socialist Yugoslavia, it is also something that is not well, so to say, I don't have many data. I have pictures about tobacco workers having their children in separate place. But there is also this institution of Delo in Igra that actually was the initial phase for establishing state-funded kindergartens. So I was talking to several tobacco workers, and they say they didn't know anything about the tobacco factory kindergarten. So the majority of them also for the majority of them, members of extended family took care about the children. So we also have to have this in mind, that that it was in the context of the family itself that took care about the children. So I have very, very little. But it was in demand of women that they should be taken some domestic burden off if they want to be not only workers but also participants in various meetings, in various let's say dopolavor activities. What is this? How do Yeah.
But sometimes it was also related to commuting, right? So
Yes.
maybe the village women there wouldn't really have facilities. I don't know if that was the case in some of this, but I don't know. For the textile workers, you could see that there's a very big gap between those living in the city and accessing the service and the ones in the rural areas, which were always slower to get something.
This is really, in terms of empirical material, I have very little data, but it's a very interesting question. Maybe I will find some more.
Thank you. Yes, Zgodovina, please. Do you have time?
It's 4.
Ah,
We are at 4, right?
Yeah. Okay. So I really enjoyed this debate, and I'm returning back to the point that I think Mansa wanted to make in her paper about how we should look at the intellectual work as a labor rather than status of being an intellectual, and how the status was denied to women even though they did the labor. I wonder, have you, since you were looking at rather long historical period where we had several ruptures, and Irene project is dealing with exactly how these historical ruptures influence these longitudinal processes. So I suppose that women were not denied the status of intellectual in the same way over these different historical periods. And if you could tell, so they were not denied in the same way or to the same extent in the different historical periods. I don't know about the periods that you're talking about, but I'm absolutely sure that, for instance, the rupture or the establishment of socialist Yugoslavia made this significant difference in enabling or allowing women to be considered doing the intellectual work. However, there was also a redefinition of an intellectual, and I don't know about intellectual in particular, but I know about the scientist. So the scientist was shifted from, not completely, but the notion was shifted from scientist as a genius, as intellectual, to scientific worker, to somebody who is part of a scientific community for which is part of an economic plan, is connected with other sectors of society and so forth. So I wonder about this shift over time. And I have another short question about for Rachel, whether in the materials you were looking into, the veiling of Muslim women was a relevant issue, whether Muslim women were workers, since this also comes up as an issue after the Second World War as part of the unveiling campaign, with the argument that we should enable women to participate in the workforce freely, therefore they should be unveiled.
Thanks. Yeah, of course, you're completely right. There is, of course, a vast change in the time before World War I, after World War I, and after the Second World War. Of course, women gained in Yugoslavia the right to vote. They could go to university from after World War I on. So they at least, this on the formal level, they could achieve many things, but more things than they did before. But as you also saw, for example, with Anica Lokar, within the families still decided who is going to study and who won't. And maybe if you were a son, the chances were that you were the one who's going to study medicine and, the girl will study something else. Also, Nada Krajgar, for example, that I have here, she really wanted to, I think, study chemistry, but then at home they convinced her it was cheaper and faster and it's better for her to study languages. So, you have this division of who studies what. So I think this is one part of the question. The second is that also after the World War II, it's not a monolithic time, it's a very diverse time. Within every 5 or 10 years, the system changes. So we see straight in 45 all the agitprop texts about what art should be like, who are the artists, the lists of artists who will write, the new future through, they have analyze the whole pop culture, like what does movie mean, how to make movies, what is the perfect socialist movie, and so on. But what we see here is that from writers, journalists, potential movie makers, and so on this list, there are not many women. There are maybe, I would say, less than 5% of them. So the after-war establishment still had in their mind that the artistic or intellectual production within the public space will be more or less men's place. Of course, this during the years changed, and it was also not the same in all republics. But
my question was rather about the First World War, since you were looking at the biographies of these.
So what changed after the World War I?
Or if any other historical moment is an actual, watershed
Milestone.
Yeah, it also depends of generation. For many women, of course, it was too late. They already had their, they were already too old to study or to, this was one thing. But the other thing is, I think that for Yugoslavia, or it's better for me to say Slovenia here, it's I see the accumulation of intellectual workers that we will then witness after the World War II. So there is not much of fresh female art or intellectual. Of course, we have Angela Vude. We have intellectual work, but these are particular cases. I think that's they're not that often actually. But what you see that underneath, or Paula Hočevar, but underneath this, that there is a movement that's just beginning, I would say. I mean, maybe it sounds a bit pathetic, but you see a change. You see that they write more, that they publish more, that they're, also when you see the correspondence when they're writing each other letters, you see that there is a vast wish to do something, but you can see, it's 1920 now, so we have women all over. And it's also, the question of how socialist and communist women were banned from public sphere, how they hardly enter the public sphere if there were political workers, because, it's the right to vote was still not gained and so on. So I think it is a change, but when you see changes the first years after the war, it brings sort of a feeling of optimism, I would say, that you can merely see in their writings, diaries. It's more of private writings than public writings in general. Yes. Thank you.
Did you thank you for your question. I have to say that the source material that I'm using I didn't have access to any kind of worker register, personnel files of the factory, anything like that. I'm really looking at these testimonies that women gave, and also the way that the written demands that were given to the administration. And what's very interesting about this case as well, looking at the different ways that the women workers were making their demands, was that at no point are they making them in terms of nation or religion. So there very well could have been Muslim women working at the factory. I have no idea. I mean, I think it's very likely. I think also in the countryside, where you're looking at the places where farmers would have brought the tobacco for the initial sorting, I think you would have probably seen a good chunk of, you could see it maybe there as well, but I can't really say. And what's interesting about that is that it wasn't considered relevant, and particularly in the historiographical context of Habsburg Bosnia, which is often very dominated by this sort of national categories or ethno-religious categories, that in a lot of instances, this is not how people are seeing their experiences. They're not seeing it as the most relevant way to get what they want. And I think that's really interesting and opens up a lot of questions for how we look at history and approach social history in the Habsburg Bosnian context.
Thank you.
Sorry, Ushka, you raised your hand, right?
Yes, I have a question for Rachel.
Please.
I'm very much curious about the dubious behavior that was always a lot of times ascribed to workers, women workers, and you also mentioned that one named one tobacco worker a whore.
The police called them a whore.
Yeah. So, but my question was if you got any sources about how these tobacco workers were perceived in the family, in the surrounding society, which I think it was rather traditional not in the way how women's roles, social roles were perceived. Because I just to give you an example that I got, there is Catholic writer in Ljubljana, Jakob Aleševec, who brings about polygamy of these women, promiscuity of these women, and how they were a bit light women, so to say. And I would just like to see if there is anything similar that you got across your studies.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting question. There's definitely when people want to delegitimize or insult women tobacco workers, it's very much this like sexual morality, like when are you going to go get vaccinated against venereal diseases, like equating them to prostitutes, this kind of thing. This is done, there's a lot of complaints about this being done by the police to them. I think another important thing to keep in mind is that women are the largest number of industrial workers in Sarajevo at this point in time. Like this is the largest sort of industrial workplace, and they're the biggest number. Also though, and you see this in other factories, I think I learned about it in the Ottoman context, like oftentimes families are also working in the same factory together. So one of the women who's arrested, her husband actually works there as well. So I'm not entirely sure, but it's an interesting question. But I would think also just like, because there's so many women employed here, that it would be interesting to kind of look at in places, comparing to places where maybe tobacco is not as much of an industrial workplace, and that there's not as strong a female labor force, because that's something in Sarajevo, like it's a really quite a substantial female labor force. So kind of answers.
Yes.
So coming back to Jovana's question about ruptures and watershed moments, and leaving aside the fact that these are actually, I mean, problematic concepts for a moment.
Yeah.
But would you, I mean, thinking about World War I and the dissolution or the collapse of the Habsburg Empire, if we try to apply the idea of a rupture or watershed moment to that particular moment in time, besides politics, was this really a watershed moment? Was this really a rupture? I mean, I'm looking at this from different perspectives, not from a gender perspective, but did something really change?
It depends very strongly who you are. For example, for Virginia Woolf, who was upper class woman living in London, many things have changed and she observed them, like how society changed and so on. But for her personally, she, more or less stayed the same. But imagine if you were coming from Bukovina and the whole national structure changed. Before, you were Jewish person from Bukovina who studied in Vienna, for example. For you, the whole world changed. So I think that there was rupture, and you can say, yeah, this is this is political rupture, but this is also social rupture, and it's also, I think, can be also gendered, because the way that for women, gender became, they had to, if they were married later, they had to decide, which nationality to keep, a question that before that wasn't so prominent. And this can be as well political question as well as also very personal question disconnected to your heritage, to your beliefs, and so on. So I think that of course there are in the diaries of women, especially young women who lived in Vienna and came from the Bosnia or Bukovina and so on. You read texts that are absolutely heartbreaking about how they see the world collapsing, and not only that, they also write, for example, Maria Winsky, Jewish person who was later studied in Vienna, but then later married someone from Croatia and lived in Zagreb. So very complicated story. She wrote systematically every day how the world after the war is much worse. How during the war they were waiting for it to be over, but then the first 2 or 3 years after the war in Vienna were supposedly horrible, also with the diseases and lack of food and so on. So.
But this was really not a change, actually, or not a rupture. I mean, because they had problems with supply and I mean, so.
I mean, rising anti-Semitism is the thing that happens in Vienna after World War I. That was before that it existed, but it was very politicized after the war. It was dangerous after the World War I, whereas before World War I it wasn't. It didn't affect lives of normal students, let's say. Whereas after the World War I it did. The huge protests and so on that happened at the University of Vienna. So.
But maybe here I would again bring about this Kubilca's case, who, for instance, when she returned to Yugoslavia, when she returned back to her native Ljubljana, she stopped to be a very active member of the painting society here. I mean, she was more painting also, kako se reče, tiho žitje.
Still lives.
Yes, still lives, and less portraits than she did, and actually for her, stemming from her letters, for instance, she was very much included into German-speaking society. And when for her, actually the world collapsed when Slovenia became part of Yugoslavia, because she was also in Sarajevo and she was not very fond of Yugoslav movement or Slavic pro-Yugoslav movement very much. So for her it was a change. But I think maybe it could not be seen as very general or universal, but on personal, I think it had an impact. Maybe not total, as it is often said, but I think it was not without consequences.
Nina, do we have 1 minute?
Yeah, Jovana is here waiting for 1 minute. Okay, half and half you can take.
I'm just putting idea on the table, and this is obviously something we would need to research more. But it seems that after the First World War, higher education became more accessible to people and especially to women. I'm just putting it as a hypothesis, but I think it would definitely be interesting to check.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm appealed by the conversation that developed here in regard of, how do you name and vocalize and denote historical experiences. And I thought of the words by John Wallis Scott, where she thought about gender within historiography, and she was very much like supporting the position that that it's about researching the intelligibility of the historical experience and the context in which this historical experience is basically constructed, more than of recreating the historical experience. So it's just because it's such an antagonistic field that opened up here, and I think that it's an important question because it's basically epistemological question in regard to the methods of historiography that you brought up and that you also brought up.
Okay, thank you. Then with this we can conclude our first session, and we have like half an hour break, and then the break is here with coffee and biscuits. And please stay with us for the next session. And thank you very much for presentations, to the executives, and for discussion.